Back in the 80s, I couldn't afford full-price games, so budget titles became my classics. Here in the UK, you didn't need big money, just a Commodore 64 and a couple of quid. That was enough. While my brother had cash from his paper round, I was relying on pocket money. So this was my world. Mastertronic, Codemasters, Firebird. These weren't just publishers, they were the reason I got to play anything at all. The games themselves, fast, addictive, sometimes rough around the edges of course, but absolutely unforgettable. They didn't always look amazing, they didn't always play perfectly, but when they clicked, they really clicked. That feeling that maybe you'd picked up something brilliant for next to nothing. So today, we're diving into some of those budget titles on the Commodore 64. The hidden gems, the pocket money legends, and the games that delivered serious value for next to nothing. Because for a lot of us, this wasn't just part of gaming. This was gaming. Now, when people talk about retro gaming, they usually focus on the big hitters, the full-price classics everyone remembers. But for many of us, that's not what we grew up with. We grew up in the bargain bins, the cassette racks, the £1.99 section near the door of the shop. The place where you didn't always know what you were getting, but you took a chance anyway. Sometimes you'd find absolute gold. Other times, well, you learned your lesson pretty quickly. But that was part of it, that gamble, that excitement, that moment of loading something up and thinking, please be good, please be good. And behind all of that, there was a proper industry built around it. This wasn't just a few cheap games thrown together. This was a fully structured market built on doing things differently, making games quickly, selling them cheaply, and getting them into as many hands as possible. Under that sub-£3 price point, a handful of companies completely reshaped gaming. Mastertronic, Codemasters, Firebird, Alternative, alongside re-release labels like Americana, Racket, Encore and Kicks. Some created games from scratch, others brought full-price classics back for a second run, and together they created one of the most important and often overlooked parts of the Commodore 64 story. So let's start with the company that really kicked all of this off, because before budget gaming became normal, before it took over entire shelves, there was one name that changed everything, and that name was Mastertronic. If there was one name that truly defined budget gaming on the Commodore 64, it was Mastertronic. £1.99, sometimes even less, if you found that slightly battered tape in the bargain bin near the shop door. That was the magic of it. You didn't need much money, just a bit of luck and a willingness to take a chance. And if I'd been a good lad that week, my mum might even chuck in an extra quid, which meant stepping up to the £2.99 range, the mad added dimension label. That's how I ended up with the last V8, which, if I'm being honest, was a bit of a letdown. But that was always the risk, because for every one of those, there was something that made it completely worth it. Take Kikstart II. For £1.99. That might just be one of the best value games ever made. Tight controls, addictive gameplay, and that course designer meant it kept me and my friends entertained for months. We weren't just playing it, we were trying to outdo each other, usually by building the most unfair track imaginable. Then you had games like Kane, a lovely little adventure that proved you didn't need flashy graphics to get completely pulled in. Or Rogue, which felt like it had accidentally wandered in from a completely different era. No visuals to speak of, but packed with depth and ideas that were way ahead of their time. The fact something like that ended up as a £1.99 game is still kind of mad when you think about it. And then there were the moments where Mastertronic stretched things a bit further. I first played Street Hassle thanks to a £2.99 Mastertronic Plus re-release, and that slightly higher price point did make a difference. These games often had a bit more going on, usually better graphics, more content, a bit more ambition. Nighttime sat in that same space, bringing superb arcade adventure gameplay into the budget world, and showing that these games didn't have to be small or simple. They also started pulling in games from overseas under labels like Entertainment USA, and this is where you got things like Ninja, a solid game on its own, but absolutely elevated by Rob Hubbard's music. That's something you start to notice with Mastertronic. The soundtracks often punched way above their weight. One Man and His Droid is another perfect example. decent game, but that music is what people still remember, as the music was used on a nice little minigame which would load in before the actual game itself, which we will look at shortly. You've got the ones that just stuck with you personally. Kane and Kane II, for me, superb childhood games. Action Biker, which looking back feels like a very early open world idea in an 8-bit sense. Very addictive and no doubt amongst your favourites. Finders keepers with that unmistakable tune that instantly takes you back the moment you hear it. And every now and then, Mastertronic would surprise you with something deeper. The Captive is a great example. Addictive, complex, and far more involved than you'd expect at this price point, even if the graphics are a little rudimentary. It was the gameplay that sealed the deal. Feud and the Curse of Sherwood clearly took inspiration from games like Firelord, but still managed to stand on their own. And Kobayashi Maru, one of those games I remember simply because I actually managed to finish it, as zany as the whole concept was, and back then this felt like a superb achievement. You should check out this game on the channel, as it's actually a pretty smart interface for an adventure game. Technically, it's kind of amazing any of this worked at all. These games were built from cassette, which generally meant long load times, limited memory, and very little room for error. Developers had to be efficient, that's why you see tight gameplay loops, reused assets, simple ideas done really well. They weren't wasting space as they couldn't afford to. As briefly mentioned earlier, here's Invade-a-Load, that little bit of genius from Richard Applin that turned loading time into something playable. Instead of staring at a screen, you'd got a mini shoot 'em up while the main game loaded. And if you were anything like me, you'd stop the tape at just the right moment just to keep playing it. It sometimes was better than the actual game it came with. In my case, I remember this loading up before Ghostbusters though on the Ricochet label games, so I wasn't missing out on that game. I just tried to get my highest score before Ghostbusters would appear on screen. Good times. Of course, not everything was a hit. Far from it. Or was it? Chiller was brutally difficult. I could barely get past the second level. However, I'm proud that I managed to get to level 3 on a live stream. Milk Race looked promising but never quite lived up to it. Another game I think I broke a joystick on as a kid, with the waggling. Master Chess was probably cheaper than a real chess set, and I remember playing it without really knowing what I was doing, but enjoying it anyway. I never actually learnt chess until I got Battle Chess for my Amiga many years later. The human race was so hard, most of us never even heard the full soundtrack, never mind get to the next level. Again, I covered all these games in detail individually on the channel, so check them out when you get chance. And then you had the ones that were just bad. Super Trolley, for obvious reasons, best left alone. Magic Carpet, where the difficulty goes from manageable to completely ridiculous. Okay, this wasn't a bad game, just brutally difficult. However, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, well, I'd switch this one off after about 30 seconds, as it was just poor, I'm afraid. And of course, Bionic Granny. Enough said. But that was the beauty of Mastertronic. It wasn't about consistency, it was about opportunity. It gave you access to more games than you ever could have afforded otherwise. Some were brilliant, some were terrible, but every now and then you'd find one that stuck with you for life. And for £1.99, that was more than enough. Now, once Mastertronic proved this whole thing could work, it didn't take long for others to jump in. But one company didn't just follow the formula, they gave it personality. And that company was Codemasters. Because Codemasters didn't hide behind sub-labels, they didn't need to. The name itself was the budget brand. and everything about their games reflected that. These were the tapes that practically shouted at you from the shelf. New release! Superb! Brilliant! Every single cassette. Big claims, bold marketing, and if we're being honest, sometimes just a little bit over the top. Because yeah, not every Codemasters game lived up to that hype. But when they did, they really did. I mean, who could forget the simulators? Codemasters absolutely loved a simulator. BMX Simulator, Professional Skateboard Simulator, ATV Simulator, Grand Prix Simulator, Rallycross Simulator, Professional Snooker Simulator, Pro Boxing Simulator, Professional Ski Simulator. It felt like if something moved, or even looked like it might move, Codemasters said, let's turn it into a simulator. I'm always half expecting Toaster Simulator, Bus Stop Simulator, or my personal favourite, Waiting for Your Tape to Load Simulator. But here's the thing, as ridiculous as that sounds, a lot of them were actually really good. BMX Simulator is still one of their best in my opinion. Tight controls, genuinely competitive and brilliant in 2-player mode, which is where it really shines, because the computer opponent could be absolutely brutal. Professional Skateboard Simulator is another one. Simple idea but really well executed, although that opinion is not really consensual, as some hated it. Rallycross Simulator for me was one of the best top-down races on the Commodore 64, and I'd play this one to death as a kid. Even something like Professional Snooker Simulator, which on paper sounds rather dull, but it was a genuinely solid game for its time. Another one. Better than Steve Davis Snooker any day, and £7 cheaper. Then you've got Fruit Machine Simulator, and I have to mention this one because in our house this was massive. It might sound niche now, but back in the day it was one of those games my dad actually loved playing with us. Simple, addictive, and very nostalgic. Thankfully, not everything was a simulator. You had Dizzy, and all the variations that came with him. Fantasy World Dizzy, Treasure Island Dizzy, Quick Snacks Dizzy, well, maybe not. And what's interesting is how different some of these were across platforms. Quick Snacks on the C64 wasn't really a port, it was almost a completely different game, but that little egg character became one of the most recognisable faces of 8-bit gaming, and Codemasters absolutely knew they had something there thanks to the original Oliver Twins creation. Then there were the more unusual ones. Rockstar Ate My Hamster, completely bonkers but brilliant. I still haven't heard anyone say anything bad about this one. Oh wait a minute, I don't think this was a budget game. Drat. Ah well, it still deserves a mention. Never mind. Kamikaze. Simple, full of personality. Really enjoyed this one. Tilt, based on such a basic idea, but the physics were ahead of its time, and it's superb to see this running on a Commodore 64. I even got this completely free with Commodore Format Issue 48. So even better than a budget game. I think it was $2.99 retail price, so you may as well have just bought the magazine, which was only £2.95 at the time anyway. But then again, you'd have to wait until its release in September of 1994. Spiky in Transylvania, a really nice little adventure, even if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be called, depending on where you looked. You also had a real mix across the range. Poltergeist, a fast, solid blaster. Vampire, also known as Phantomas 2. Slightly awkward, but still enjoyable. Ninja Massacre, not quite Gauntlet, but a brilliant 2-player game. MiG-29 Soviet Fighter, which honestly felt like a better version of Afterburner than the official one. Not that that was particularly difficult, but still. Then you've got things like Wacky Darts, which somehow works thanks to its simplicity, even if it does look like a specky game. SAS Combat Simulator, which actually packs quite a lot into a budget game and was a sort of Commodore style game played horizontally. And Arcade Flight Simulator, which sounds like a contradiction, but ends up being a decent little shoot 'em up. Of course, not everything was going to be great. With Super Robin Hood, for example, my greatest memories of this are falling through platforms and missing jumps, but still, I kind of enjoyed playing it anyway at the time, mostly because of that superb David Whittaker music. Super Stuntman, entertaining for about 5 minutes I suppose, but nothing special. But nothing could be as bad as the Guardian Angel, or Freddy Hardest in South Manhattan, which I remember getting, being completely disappointed with, and asking my mum to take it back to the shop so I could swap it, which sort of tells you everything. But that was Codemasters. They weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing value. Cheap, accessible and fun, that was the goal. And yeah, they probably did a fair bit of cashing in along the way with their superb and brilliant marketing. But it worked. It definitely worked on me. They might have overhyped things a little, and yeah, they probably made more simulators than anyone ever needed. But when Codemasters got it right, they delivered some of the most memorable budget games of the entire era. Now, while Mastertronic built the foundation and Codemasters brought the personality, there was another company doing something a bit more calculated, a bit more structured, and in some ways, a bit more ambitious. And that company was Firebird. Firebird felt different from the start. This wasn't just another budget label trying to compete on price, this was Telecomsoft, part of British Telecom, stepping into gaming with a clear plan. They weren't just throwing games onto shelves, they were organising the market. Their Firebird Silver range launched in the mid-80s at around £2.50, before dropping into that crucial £1.99 bracket as competition ramped up. And unlike a lot of budget publishers, they kept a real focus on quality. But where Firebird really stood out was what they did with re-releases. Because suddenly, games that had originally cost £9.99 were sitting there on my local market stall shelves for pocket money. Awesome! For someone like me at the time, that was massive. Hero, a true Activision classic, now £1.99. Decathlon, the joystick destroyer itself, back again for less than £2. Probably costing us more in broken quickshots than the game ever did. And River Raid, another Activision legend, suddenly accessible to anyone with a couple of quid in their pocket. It didn't stop there. Park Patrol, another brilliant little game that just felt like a steal at that price. Zenji as well, one of those slightly odd, more thoughtful games that you might have never tried if it wasn't sitting right there in the budget rack. That was the Firebird effect. They weren't just making games cheap, they were opening up an entire catalogue that had previously been out of reach, but they weren't relying on re-releases alone. Because then you had something like Thrust, a £1.99 game that had absolutely no business being that good. Simple idea, Thrust, gravity, collect, escape, but brutally addictive. The kind of game that proves you don't need complexity to create something special. In fact, it became one of the defining titles of the budget era. And when you dig deeper into their catalogue, it's full of these little surprises. Eyeball, great gameplay, brilliant Rob Hubbard soundtrack, and one of those games I remember well, even after all these years. Warhawk. Fast, smooth and polished in a way you don't always expect from a budget title. BMX Kids. Again, more examples of how Firebird managed to deliver strong experiences at that lower price point. Also, listen to Rob Hubbard's classic soundtrack for BMX Kids. That to me was worth the £2 in itself. And then you've got the quirky side of things. Mad Nurse. Completely mental, slightly ridiculous, but genuinely funny at the same time. The Prince. One of those games where you're not entirely sure what's going on, but you keep playing anyway because, well, it costs £1.99. Pneumatic Hammers, another one that's hard to explain unless you've actually played it. And even then, you're still not entirely sure what you've just experienced. Check out my video on the channel where I do try to go into this game in more detail. That goes for the majority of these games within the video. If you want a deeper dive, just search the playlists. Each of these publishers have their own sections. You might find games you'd completely forgotten, because these ones were a little more obscure, but also ones that really stuck. Halls of the Things, one of my personal favourites growing up, and still just as addictive now as it was back then. Even though it does rely on a lot of keyboard and joystick combination controls, once you get used to that, it's a lot less fiddly as it seems. Booty, a game I absolutely love for some very strange reason, even if you could die from what felt like a 2cm drop. Ollie and Lisa, with that unmistakable Ben Daglish soundtrack. Caverns of Ereban, easily one of the toughest games I ever played. So tough, I somehow forgot to include it in my hardest games list. And of course, Firebird had their fair share of brutal games. Spiky Harold looks harmless. Absolutely isn't. No wonder you get so many lives in this game, because you soon get through them. Freak Factory. Just strange. The Ninja Master. Probably one we'd all quietly like to forget. But that mix, that balance between quality, experimentation and sheer randomness, that's what made Firebird so interesting. And unlike some of the others, they evolved. Firebird Silver eventually became Silverbird, with clearer price tiers at £1.99 and £2.99, streamlining the whole budget side of the business. At one point they were juggling multiple labels at once, and as a kid, I'll be honest, it was a bit confusing. You had Firebird, Silverbird, even Rainbird handling more premium titles. It felt like a full publishing system all on its own, but that's exactly what it was. Now here's where things take a really interesting turn, because not all budget games were actually made as budget games. Some of the biggest titles you'd find amongst those £1.99 shelves had already lived a completely different life. They were full-price games, given a second chance. And this is where the re-releases labels comes in. For a lot of us, this was the moment everything changed, because up until now, buying a budget game was always a bit of a gamble. You didn't really know what you were getting. It might be brilliant, it might be awful, and half the fun was finding out. But then you started recognising names, games you'd heard about, games you'd maybe seen in magazines months earlier, games your mates had talking about, but you could never afford at the time. And now, there they are, sitting right in front of you for £1.99. That's where companies like Alternative Software came into their own. They weren't creating new budget titles, they were buying up older catalogues, repackaging them, and putting them back out there in a way that made them feel brand new again. And as a kid, that's all that mattered. I didn't care if it had come out years before, it was new to me. Then you had labels like Americana and Racket, closely tied into Mastertronic's world. These were bringing back games from publishers like US Gold and Hewson, titles that had originally been big-name releases, now finding a second life on the budget shelf. So suddenly you've got games like Uridium or Sanction sitting there alongside everything else, and you're thinking, how is this the same price as some random tape next to it? And that's when the whole experience shifted. It wasn't just about taking a chance anymore. Sometimes you knew exactly what you were getting. You weren't just discovering hidden gems, you were picking up proven classics at a fraction of the price. Encore and Kix carried that idea even further. more re-releases, more recognisable titles, more chances to play games you'd missed the first time around. It turned the budget scene into something much bigger than just cheap software. It became a second wave of gaming, a second opportunity for these games to reach a whole new audience. And looking back, that's probably one of the most important parts of the entire budget era. The fact that games didn't just disappear after their initial release. They didn't just fade away once they had their moment. They came back, they found new players, and for many of us that's when we experienced them for the first time. Because for all the talk about budget games being smaller or simpler, this side of the market proved something else entirely. Sometimes the best games weren't the ones you paid the most for. They were the ones you found later, sitting quietly in a bargain bin, just waiting to be picked up. I wish that was the same these days. Those old games I had as a kid are back to full price again, or worse. Crazy how the prices of these games has inflated. Up to this point, we've looked at the game, some of the publishers, and the way the whole system worked. When you look back now, it's easy to forget just how limited everything was. These weren't loading instantly from a hard drive or a cartridge, this was a cassette. You'd press play, wait for what felt like an age for them to load, and just hope the thing didn't fail right at the very end. And if it did, you were straight back to the beginning. For many of us, it was these budget games, the ones we could actually afford, the ones we picked up without really knowing what we were getting, the ones that sometimes disappointed, but every now and then completely surprised us, because that was the magic of it. I'd walk into the market with a couple of quid in my pocket and my mum alongside me, pick something up purely on instinct, and take it home not knowing whether I'd just wasted a week's worth of pocket money or found something I was going to be playing for the whole week. And that feeling, that moment of loading up a game for the very first time, hoping it would actually load, and then finally getting control of something completely new, that's something you don't really get anymore. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and let me know what you thought of any of these games in the comments. I'd also really like to hear from your memories of these games and which budget titles stand out as your favourites. As always, your support makes a big difference, so consider subscribing for more content like this. Take a look through the playlist for more Commodore classics and feel free to stick around. There's another video coming up right now. Hopefully, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, bye for now. To everyone on Patreon and all my YouTube members, thank you, not just for the support, but for believing in what this channel is trying to do. You're helping me keep these memories alive, and that genuinely means a lot to me. Thanks guys, stay retro.